The boy came over the ridge like the devil himself was riding his coattails, and Ruby Whitfield dropped the branding iron she had been cooling in the rain barrel to catch him before he pitched face first off his pony. Doc Whitfield. Doc Whitfield, come quick. He could not have been more than 10 years old, the youngest of the Prout boys from the claim 2 miles east, and his voice cracked in a way that told her he had been crying and trying not to. The mare's dying. Mr. Haskins' mare, she's down in the berthing and everyone says the foal's already dead inside her. And there was shooting, Doc, there was shooting and Mr. Haskins is bleeding. I saw it myself. Slow down, Sammy. Ruby gripped the boy's shoulders, steadying him, though her own pulse had leapt into her throat at the word *shooting. You saw Mr. Haskins bleeding, with your own eyes. I heard it. Pa said it. Pa said men come through the north pasture shooting off their pistols just to spook the herd. And the mare got so scared she went down wrong, and now the foal's turned backward and everybody says there's no saving it. And Mr. Haskins got throwed off his horse trying to catch her, and the boy ran out of breath entirely and simply stood there, chest heaving, eyes huge. Ruby had learned, in 5 years of doctoring horses and cattle and the occasional stubborn hog across this stretch of Dakota territory, that panic in fact rarely traveled in the same wagon. Somewhere between the boy's 2 stories was a truth worth writing for, and she did not intend to wait until it sorted itself out. Go tell your pa I'm headed for the Haskins place, she said, already moving for the barn where her mare stood saddled from the morning's work. And Sammy breathed. Whatever's happened, hollering half of it to every homestead between here and there won't fix a single part of it. She was in the saddle with her bag of instruments strapped behind the cantle before the boy had even turned his pony around, and she put her heels to her horse and rode west along the fence line she and Thomas had strung with their own hands 5 years past the wheat stubble already cut and shocked for the coming thrashing, past the slough where the ducks were gathering thick for their autumn flight south, out toward the cottonwoods that marked the edge of Harlan Haskins' range. She had met the man exactly twice. Once at the land office in Bristlecone, where he had stood in line behind her arguing good-naturedly with the clerk about a grazing permit, and once at Sunday service, where he had nodded to her with a courtesy that seemed almost old-fashioned, a small bow of the head that belonged more to a Spanish don than a Dakota cattleman. She knew he ran perhaps 400 head with a crew of vaqueros he had brought north from Texas, men whose skill with a rope and a horse was spoken of with a grudging respect by ranchers who would not have invited them to supper. She knew his mother had been born near San Antonio, and his father a Texas cattleman named Haskins who had married her against the wishes of both their families, and that Harlan carried both bloodlines the way a man carries 2 good hands, using each as it was needed. Beyond that she knew nothing of him at all, save that a boy had just told her his best mare was down and might already be past saving, and that gunfire had been part of the reason. The Haskins ranch house came into view first, low and solid, built of milled lumber rather than sod, with a wide veranda that spoke of a man who had meant to stay. Beyond it, near the horse barn, a knot of men stood in a loose circle, and even at a distance Ruby could hear the mares screaming. She swung down before her horse had fully stopped and pushed through the gathered vaqueros without ceremony. I'm the veterinarian, she said, in case any of them doubted a woman arriving alone had business here. Someone tell me what's happened, quickly, and someone else fetch clean water and all the rope you have. A young man with a thin mustache and worried eyes stepped forward. Senora, the mare Estrella, she is trying 12 hours now. The foal will not come. Don Harlan says to send for the doctor in town, but the doctor in town does not treat horses, and then the boy said he would fetch you instead. He was right, too. Ruby was already kneeling at the mare's flank, running her hands along the swollen belly with the calm, deliberate pressure she had learned from her father in an Ohio barn 20 years before. Estrella lay on her side in the straw, sides heaving, eyes rolled white with pain and terror, and when Ruby reached inside to feel what waited there, her stomach dropped even as her voice stayed even. Breech, she said. Hind legs first and one of them's turned wrong at the hock. That's why nothing's progressing. She cannot push a foal shaped like that. Then it is as they said. The vaquero's voice was heavy. The foal is doomed. The foal is difficult, Ruby corrected sharply, not doomed. Doomed is what men say when they have already decided not to try. It was then that Harlan Haskins arrived at a dead run from the direction of the north pasture, and Ruby's first clear look at him was of a man with blood on his shirt sleeve, dust ground into the creases of his face, and an expression that shifted the instant he saw her kneeling, and the straw shifted from the raw fear of a man about to lose something he loved to something more guarded, more assessing. "You're the Whitfield woman," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm Ruby Whitfield, yes, and your mare needs both of us to stop talking and start working. Are you hurt?" "It's nothing. A graze is all from when she threw me." He was already shrugging out of his coat, rolling his sleeves, kneeling on the other side of the mare without being asked, and something in the economy of that movement told Ruby he had done this work before, had midwifed foals in worse conditions than a clean barn with lantern light. "Tell me what you need." "I need you to hold her head and talk to her. Keep her from thrashing while I work the leg around. And I need you to trust that a woman's hands are exactly what your mare needs right now, because I do not have time to convince you twice." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, not quite surprise, and he moved to the mare's head without another word. The next quarter hour passed in a language all its own, made of low words to a frightened animal and the particular silence of hard, careful work. Ruby worked by feel more than sight, her arm buried to the shoulder, easing the turned leg forward a fraction at a time between the mare's contractions, feeling for the moment when the joint would give rather than break. Twice the mare screamed and lunged, and twice Harlan held her, murmuring to her in Spanish, his voice dropping into a register that seemed to reach the animal even through her pain, a low sing-song that Ruby recognized without understanding a word of it as the sound of a man who had spent a lifetime gentling frightened creatures. "There," Ruby breathed, feeling the leg finally rotate true. "There, that's it. Now when she pushes again, I need every one of you ready to pull gently with me, on my word only." The next contraction came, and Ruby guided, and 4 hands besides her own took hold where she directed, and with a final, shuddering effort the mare delivered a wet, still, impossibly small foal into the straw. For a moment nobody moved. The foal did not stir. Someone near the barn door murmured something that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse, and Ruby heard distinctly one of the older vaqueros say quietly, "Ya está," as if to close the matter. "It is done, it is finished, there is no more to be done." "It is not finished," Ruby said, and she said it loudly enough that every man in that barn heard her. She cleared the foal's nose and mouth with her fingers, then bent and did something none of them had ever seen a woman do to a horse. She breathed into its nostril, hard, twice, and pressed her palm rhythmically against the small ribs, willing the heart beneath them to remember its purpose. The foal's flank twitched. A ragged, wet breath rattled through its body, and then another, and then it lifted its head with the bewildered, furious indignation of every creature that has just discovered the enormous inconvenience of being born. The barn erupted. Men who a moment before had stood in the silence of expected grief now laughed and swore and slapped one another on the back, and Estrella, exhausted, twisted her neck around to nose at the small wet shape beside her with a sound low in her throat that needed no translation in any language. Ruby sat back on her heels, breathing hard, her arms slicked to the elbow, and found Harlan Haskins looking at her the way a man looks at something he has decided, quite suddenly, he was wrong about. "They told me there was no saving it," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "I believed them mostly because I did not know what else there was to believe." "People say doomed when they are afraid to hope," Ruby said, wiping her arm on a rag one of the men handed her. "I've found it is rarely as true as they think." He studied her for a long moment, and there was nothing insulting in the way he did it, Nothing of the appraisal she sometimes suffered from men who did not expect competence to arrive wearing a woman's face. It was something quieter than that. Something like a door opening a crack in a wall he had built a long time ago. "Amundsen," he said suddenly, looking down at the foal struggling to gather its impossibly long legs beneath it in the lantern light. "Dawn. That will be her name, since she came so near to not coming at all. It suits her." Ruby got to her feet, gathering her instruments, feeling suddenly and entirely aware of how close he stood, of the low, steady warmth of him in the cool evening barn. "Now, someone mentioned shooting and a graze on your arm that you're calling nothing. I'd like to look at that, and I'd like to know exactly who was firing pistols across your north pasture, because scaring a heavy-bellied mare into a breech berth is not the same thing as bad luck, Mr. Haskins, and I don't believe for one moment that you think it is either." His jaw tightened, and the softness she had glimpsed a moment before receded behind something harder, more careful. "No," he said. "I don't believe it was bad luck at all." The wound on his arm turned out to be a graze rather than a true bullet strike, the crease of dark powder-burned cloth telling Ruby that whoever had fired those shots had not been aiming to kill, only to frighten, and had frightened rather more than a foal and a mare. Harlan sat on an upturned crate in the tack room while she cleaned it, and though he did not flinch under the sting of the carbolic wash, she felt the tension running the length of his arm like a drawn bowstring. "Riders came through from the northeast around midday," he said, when she pressed him for the accounting the boy Sammy had garbled so badly. "4 of them, maybe 5. Cut straight through the herd rather than around it, which no man does by accident on land he does not mean trouble on. When my hands rode to turn them off, one fired into the air, not at anyone, at the sky to scatter the cattle and scatter us with them. It worked well enough. Estrella was near her time already and the noise sent her running and running sent her down wrong. Do you know who they were? I know whose grass they crossed to reach mine." His voice had gone flat, careful, the voice of a man choosing each word like a man crossing a river on stones he did not entirely trust. "Cornelius Vance runs cattle on the open range north of the section line, more cattle than that range can rightly hold, and every fall he finds some reason his herd needs to pass through land that belongs to smaller men, mine included. This year he has a reason with teeth in it. There's a spur line coming through from the railroad next summer, and whoever holds clear title to the creek land when the surveyors finish their work stands to make a fortune selling right-of-way. Whoever does not hold clear title finds it rather harder to prove they were ever there at all." Ruby's hands went still on the bandage. "That's the second time this week I've heard Cornelius Vance's name spoken like a threat rather than a neighbor's. You'll hear it a third time before the week is out, I expect, if you're the widow Whitfield who filed on the section along Willow Creek in the spring of '80. I heard your husband died this past winter. I am sorry for it. I did not know him well, but the men who did speak well of him. Thomas fell through ice hauling wood off the creek in February," Ruby said, the old grief moving through her chest in the familiar, worn groove it had carved there, dulled now but never quite gone. "I've 5 years' improvements on that claim and a hearing at the land office in 3 weeks that will finally give me clear patent to it, and I intend to be standing there when it happens, whatever Cornelius Vance thinks about where his cattle ought to graze come spring." Something in Harlan's expression sharpened into real attention. 3 weeks, he repeated. "That's the same term the district office set for the boundary hearing on my western grazing lease. And it's the same term Silas Cobb told me he meant to bring his survey findings before the registrar, before he disappeared from the face of the earth without so much as a note pinned to a fence post." Ruby's hands, tying off the bandage, went very still. "You knew Silas?" "I knew him well enough that he ate at my table more nights than not, this past summer, while he ran his lines along the creek and up into the high pasture. He said the old surveys did not match the new ones in ways that were not accidents. He said he meant to prove it before the registrar sat again in the fall." Then one morning in late August, his horse came home to my corral with an empty saddle, and no man in this county has laid eyes on Sila's cob since. He boarded with me for 2 months this summer, Ruby said quietly, the memory of Sila's cob's easy laugh and careful, ink-stained hands rising unbidden. He was Thomas's oldest friend from Ohio. He came out after the funeral meeting to help me settle the estate papers, and he stayed on because he found something in the old plats that troubled him. He would not tell me everything. He said it was safer for me not to carry more than I needed to. But the night before he rode north, he pressed a folded page into the spine of my Bible and told me if anything ever happened to him, I should look there, and I should trust the man who had promised to look after me in his stead. Harlan's eyes met hers, and in them Ruby saw the same startled recognition she felt herself, the strange vertigo of discovering that a stranger has been standing, unknowing, on the far side of the very same doorway. He told me something almost exactly like that, Harlan said slowly. The last time I saw him, he said, Harlan, if I do not come back from this, there is a widow on Willow Creek who will need a friend who understands horses and understands men like Vance both. Promise me you will be that friend. I thought it strange talk for a man riding out to check survey stakes. I understand it rather better now. Outside, the barn had gone quiet around the small miracle of the foal finding its feet at last, wobbling, folding, trying again, while its mother nosed encouragement into its damp coat. Neither Ruby nor Harlan moved for a long moment, each turning over the shape of the promise they had, without ever having met, already begun to keep. 3 weeks, Ruby said at last. A hearing that could unmake Vance's whole scheme if Silas's evidence ever sees daylight, and a missing man who trusted us each to look after the other. I don't believe in coincidence that tidy, Mr. Haskins. Neither do I, Mrs. Whitfield. He rose, testing his bandaged arm, and for the first time since she had arrived at a dead run into his yard, he smiled, brief and real. It seems we have a promise to keep, and precious little time to keep it in. I would be glad of your company in the keeping of it if you'll have mine. I generally prefer company that doesn't wait until a woman's arm deep in a difficult berth to decide she might be worth listening to, Ruby said, but there was no sting in it, only the beginning of something that might, given time and reason, become trust. I noticed the worth considerably faster than that, Harlan said quietly. I only needed the birth to be sure of it. The days that followed carried the particular urgency of early autumn on the Dakota plains, when the wheat stood shocked in the fields waiting for the thrashing crews, when the first frost still hung 3 or 4 weeks off, but every rancher and farmer worked as though it might arrive tomorrow, and when the county fair in Bristlecone loomed on every family's calendar as the one certain gathering before winter closed its long hand over the prairie. Ruby returned twice more to the Haskins ranch in the first week to check on Amincer's strength and Estrella's recovery, and found herself staying longer each visit than the foal's health strictly required, sharing coffee on the veranda with Harlan as the light went gold and long across his pastures, learning the shape of a man who spoke of his mother's people with a fierce, quiet pride and of his father's people with an equally fierce, if more complicated, loyalty. My father married against his family's wishes and mine both, in a manner of speaking, he told her one such evening, turning his cup in his hands. My mother's brothers thought no daughter of theirs should marry a gringo cattleman who could not speak 2 words of Spanish without murdering them. My father's people thought the same thing turned around. We grew up between the two, my brother Mateo and I, belonging entirely to neither side and entirely to both. There are men in this county, Vance chief among them, who look at my crew and see nothing but cheap labor that ought to know its place and be grateful for the wage. My vaqueros have forgotten more about horses and cattle than Vance's hired guns will ever learn, and it costs me nothing to say so and everything to men like him to hear it. It seems to me, Ruby said, that a great deal of what troubles this county comes down to men like Vance deciding, in advance and without evidence, who deserves to hold land and who does not. That is precisely the trouble, Harlan said. And it is precisely why Silas Cobb's survey findings frighten him more than any bullet ever could. Proof that a man cheated is a debt that can be called due in a court of law. Rumor of it is only talk, and talk Vance has always known how to buy his way clear of. Ruby had by then retrieved the folded page from the spine of her Bible, though she had not yet made full sense of it. Columns of figures in Silas's careful hand, section numbers, a notation in the margin that read only BT Ridge, old signal line. Ask HH. She showed it to Harlan on her third visit, watching his face change as understanding moved across it. Bear Tooth Ridge, he said. There's an old signal station up there from the days the Army watched for trouble between the Sioux and the settlers, before either of us came to this country. Silas asked me about it once, whether the old fire pits were still visible from the valley floor. I thought it was idle curiosity. I began to think it was nothing of the kind. It was on the fourth visit, a Tuesday when Ruby had ridden over at midday with a poultice recipe for a hand-strained fetlock, that Cornelius Vance himself came calling on Harlan's ranch. And Ruby, standing in the yard with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, got her first true look at the man whose name had begun to feel like a held breath across the whole county. He arrived in a buggy too fine for the rutted ranch road, driven by a man with a low-crowned hat and a rifle laid across his knees, who did not so much as glance at the horses in the corral, only at the humans in the yard, in a manner that made the hair rise along Ruby's arms. Vance himself was perhaps 50, silver at the temples, dressed with the particular exactness of a man who wanted every observer to understand precisely how much his coat had cost. "Haskins," Vance said, not troubling to descend from the buggy, "I hear your mare had trouble foaling. Shame that. Bad luck can follow a place once it starts." "My mare and her foal are both thriving, Mr. Vance," Harlan said, his voice carrying the particular courtesy men use when they mean something considerably less courteous. "No thanks to whatever business your riders had crossing my herd without so much as a wave. My men were moving cattle to water." "If your mare took fright at the sight of honest work, that hardly seems a matter for me to answer for." Vance's gaze slid to Ruby, taking her in with the frank, assessing look of a man cataloging an inconvenience. "And this would be the widow Whitfield. I understand you've become quite the fixture in this end of the county, Mrs. Whitfield, doctoring livestock and other men's business besides, from what I hear." "I doctor whatever creature needs doctoring, Mr. Vance," Ruby said, holding his gaze without flinching, "and I mind my own business a great deal more carefully than some men mind theirs." Something flickered behind Vance's eyes, not anger exactly, but the cold recalculation of a man revising his estimate of an obstacle upward. "There's a land office hearing coming, I understand, concerning your claim on Willow Creek. I'd hate to see a widow woman travel all that way for nothing if certain irregularities were to come to light about the paperwork on that claim. Boundary disputes can drag on for years, Mrs. Whitfield. Cost a great deal of money a widow might not have." "There are no irregularities in my paperwork," Ruby said evenly, though her heart had begun to hammer. "I would think a man in your position would know exactly how clean or unclean a piece of paperwork was, given how closely you seem to follow the matter." For a moment Vance's composure slipped entirely, and what showed beneath it was something Ruby recognized from a lifetime spent reading the moods of frightened animals, the particular danger of a creature that believes itself cornered. "You do well to remember," Vance said quietly, "that this is a hard country for a woman alone, and harder still for a woman who involves herself in matters that are none of her concern. I'd think on that if I were you, before that hearing comes around." He signaled his driver without waiting for a reply, and the buggy rolled out of the yard, leaving behind it a silence that Ruby felt in the pit of her stomach. "That," Harlan said quietly, "was not a threat about paperwork." "No," Ruby agreed. "It was not." The county fair opened the following week under a sky so blue and high it seemed to Ruby like a held breath before the winter's exhale, and bristlecone filled with wagons and buggies and saddle horses from every claim within 2 days' ride. There were pens of prize cattle and pens of prize hogs, tables heavy with preserved fruit and quilts, and the fierce, quiet competition of women who had spent all summer proving their worth in sugar and thread. There was a cattle sale in the afternoon that drew ranchers from 3 counties, and there was to be a dance that evening in the new Grange Hall, the first real dance the town had managed since the spring. Ruby had not intended to attend the dance at all. Widowhood still sat on her like a garment. She had not entirely decided how to wear in public, but Harlan found her at the judging of the horses, where Amundsen, not yet 3 weeks old and already the talk of the county, stood wobbling proudly beside her recovered mother, while a crowd of children pressed close to marvel at the foal everyone had said would never draw breath. "They're calling her the miracle foal," Harlan said, coming to stand beside Ruby at the rail. "I've had 4 men ask me the name of the doctor who saved her, and every one of them looked surprised when I told them it was a woman." "I imagine they'll recover from the surprise," Ruby said dryly, though she felt a small, unfamiliar warmth at the way he said it, without apology or qualification, simply as fact. "Some will. Some will spend the rest of their lives being surprised by things that ought not to surprise a sensible man at all." He was quiet a moment, watching the foal but its head affectionately against its mother's flank. "I would be glad of your company at the dance tonight, Ruby Whitfield, if you'd allow it. Not as a doctor tending a rancher's horse, as myself asking you as yourself." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the careful, deliberate way he offered it told her he had thought about doing so for some time before finding the courage. "I haven't danced since before Thomas died," she said honestly. "I don't know that I remember how. Neither have I danced since my father died, if it comes to that, and I remember only that I was never any good at it even when I tried regularly." His smile was easy, disarming. "We could be equally poor at it together. There's a certain dignity in shared incompetence." She laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, and found that the sound of it and the answering warmth in his dark eyes had settled something in her chest that had been unsettled since the day Thomas's body had been pulled from the ice. "All right," she said. "But if you step on my feet, Mr. Haskins, I intend to charge you a doctor's fee for the damage." The Grange Hall that evening was lit with more lamps than Ruby had seen gathered in one room in years, and a trio of fiddle, guitar, and accordion filled the space with music that pulled even the most reluctant farmers onto the plank floor. Harlan Haskins was, in fact, no great dancer, and neither was Ruby, and they laughed more than they managed any true grace, and she found she did not mind in the slightest, that the clumsiness of it felt more honest and more dear to her than any polished waltz she had ever performed as a younger, less weathered woman back in Ohio. It was in a lull between dances, while she stood catching her breath near the open door with the cool night air moving in off the prairie, that she noticed Cornelius Vance across the room, watching her and Harlan with an expression that had nothing of celebration in it at all, and beside him, a lean man in a long duster she had not seen before, whose eyes moved over the crowd the way a man's eyes move when he is counting exits rather than admiring dancers. "Who is that, standing with Vance?" she asked Harlan quietly and felt him go still beside her. "I don't know him," Harlan said, "but I know the look of him. That's a man paid to do work that decent men won't do for wages, and Vance does not bring men like that to a county fair for the pleasure of the fiddle music." The man's name, Ruby would learn within days, was Reed Colton, and the bounty he had been paid to collect was $500 for evidence that would silence, one way or another, the widow on Willow Creek who intended to testify against the good name of Cornelius Vance at the land office hearing. The warning came on a night 3 days later, when the moon hung thin and Ruby woke to the smell of smoke and the frantic, high scream of her mare in the barn. She was out the door in her nightdress with a shotgun in her hands before she had fully finished waking, and found the corner of her hay barn burning, a slow, deliberate fire that had clearly been set rather than sparked by any lantern of her own, and in the flickering light, a rider already turning his horse away toward the tree line at the creek. She did not fire. She had never in her life fired at a man, and did not intend to begin now on a guess in poor light. But she shouted, and the sound of her voice carried far enough on the still autumn air that within 20 minutes Harlan Haskins came riding hard up her lane, having heard, he told her later, the shot she had eventually put into the air to summon help, carrying across 2 miles of prairie on a night grown suddenly and terribly quiet. They fought the fire together, hauling water from the well and beating at the flames with wet sacking, until the barn's corner post stood scorched and blackened, but the structure held, and her animals, terrified but unharmed, huddled in the far corner of the corral where she had driven them clear of the smoke. "This is Vance's man's work," Harlan said afterward, both of them soot-streaked and breathing hard in the gray light before dawn. "Or Vance's own doing, more likely, since Colton strikes me as too careful a man to leave a fire so clearly meant to warn rather than to kill. He is telling you what he intends if you do not withdraw your testimony." "I have nothing to withdraw," Ruby said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Silas gave me a page of figures, not a confession. I do not even know precisely what it proves. But Vance clearly believes I know more than I do, and that belief may be as dangerous to me as the truth itself." "Then you should leave this place until the hearing," Harlan said, and something in the flatness of his tone told her he had already decided this before he arrived, that the decision had ridden with him the whole 2 miles. "Come to my ranch. My mother's cousin keeps house for me. There is room, and my hands would guard the approach day and night. You would be safer there than here, alone, with a burned barn for a warning." "No," Ruby said, and the word came out sharper than she intended, sharpened by 5 years of grief and work, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who has buried a husband on land she helped clear with her own 2 hands. "This is my claim, Harlan. Thomas and I broke this ground together. I have proved up on it for 5 years through drought and this past terrible winter alone, and in 3 weeks I will stand before the registrar and receive the patent that makes it mine beyond any man's power to take it from me. I will not abandon it to sleep safe in another man's house, however kindly the offer is meant. I am not offering you a cage, Ruby. I am offering you a roof that is not currently on fire. You are offering me the same thing every man in this county has offered me since Thomas died," she said, and heard the old grief roughen her own voice, "which is the suggestion that a widow's proper place is under some man's protection rather than on her own 2 feet on her own hard-won ground. I have had that offer from 3 different suitors since February, Harlan Haskins, and I turned every one of them away for the same reason I am turning you away now, though I turn you away with considerably more regret than I felt for the others." He was silent a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice had gentled, though the trouble in it had not lessened. "That is not what I meant by it. I would not have you cower anywhere, least of all in my house, out of fear. I only cannot bear the thought of losing you to a fire that burns hotter next time, before Silas's proof ever sees daylight." "Then help me finish what Silas started," Ruby said, "instead of asking me to run from it." Before he could answer, a rider came up the lane at a hard gallop, one of Harlan's own vaqueros, a young man named Diego whose horse was blown and lathered white with effort. "Don Harlan," he gasped, swinging down before the horse had fully stopped. "It is Mateo." Vance's foreman and 3 men came to the west camp at first light. They said the grazing lease there is void, that Don Vance holds the true deed now, and when Mateo argued the point they beat him, Don Harlan. "He is hurt bad. Old Pascual sent me to fetch you at once." Ruby saw the anguished tear across Harlan's face, saw the impossible choice settle onto his shoulders like a physical weight, his brother beaten and needing him, and Ruby standing before him having just refused the very protection he had ridden through the night to offer. "Go," she said quietly before he could speak. "Your brother needs you more than my barn does this morning. Go to Mateo." Ruby, go, Harlan. I will manage here. I have managed here alone before. He looked at her for one long moment, torn nearly in half, and then he swung up onto his horse, and something closed in his expression that had been open only minutes before. I will come back the moment Mateo is settled, he said. Bar your doors and keep that shotgun loaded, and do not, whatever happens, ride anywhere alone. I make no promises I do not intend to keep, Ruby said, which was, she would reflect later, not quite the reassurance he had asked for and not quite a refusal either, and she watched him ride hard for the West Camp with Diego, and felt the whole warm, fragile thing that had begun growing between them go suddenly cold and uncertain in the gray morning light. 3 days passed with no word from the Haskins ranch. 3 days in which Ruby threshed her own wheat with the help of a hired crew from town, kept her shotgun within reach at all times, and turned over Sela's Cobb's cryptic page of figures until the paper had gone soft at the folds from handling. On the 4th day, riding into Bristlecone for supplies, she found Reed Colton leaning against the rail outside the mercantile as though he had been waiting for her specifically, which, she understood the moment his cold eyes found hers, he had. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, touching his hat with a courtesy that made the hair on her neck rise. "I hear you've had some trouble out at your place. Fire, wasn't it? Terrible thing, fire. A woman alone out there, isolated as you are. Accidents happen so easily to folks who live isolated." "Say what you mean to say, Mr. Colton," Ruby said, refusing to let her voice shake. "I have no patience left for men who speak in riddles meant to frighten." His smile did not reach his eyes. "There's a hearing coming. Some folks think a certain widow means to make trouble at it, over paperwork that's none of her concern and never was. I'd think hard, if I were that widow, about whether a piece of paper is worth more than her own safety. Mr. Vance is a generous man to those who see sense. He mentioned to me that a woman in your position might find it easier simply to sell her claim outright, at a fair price, and remove herself from a business that has already burned her barn once. You may tell Mr. Vance," Ruby said, stepping closer rather than away, drawing on every ounce of the steadiness that had carried her through breech births and grief and 5 winters on the open prairie, "that I did not homestead this claim, bury my husband on this land, and survive alone through a Dakota winter, only to sell my future to a man whose only argument is fire and fear. He may keep his fair price. I will keep my land." Colton's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Ruby thought he might reach for her right there on the open street in broad daylight, but a wagon rattled past just then, and 2 women from the church emerged from the mercantile, and whatever calculation moved behind his cold gaze, he judged the moment wrong for it. "You'll regret that answer, Mrs. Whitfield," he said quietly, and walked away down the boardwalk without another word. That night, unable to shake the encounter from her mind, Ruby sat by lamplight and studied Sela's page more carefully than she had allowed herself to before, and found at last in the margin beneath the notation about Beartooth Ridge a smaller line she had overlooked in her earlier readings, written so faintly it seemed almost an afterthought. "If I do not return by the fair, look for me where the old fires burned. I will find a way to signal if I am able." Her breath caught. Sela's had not simply vanished into some accident on a survey line. He had known, before he ever rode north, that he might need to hide, and he had left a trail meant for exactly this moment. The fair had come and gone 4 days past. She did not wait for Harlan Haskins to return from his brother's bedside. She told herself this was practicality rather than pride, that every hour spent waiting was an hour Sela's Cobb might not have, wounded or hunted somewhere in the high country north of the creek. She packed provisions for 3 days, took her father's old revolver from the strongbox beneath her bed alongside her medical kit, and left a note pinned to her own door in case Harlan came looking, though some stubborn, wounded part of her also told herself that he had chosen his brother over her once already, and might not come at all. She rode north through country that grew rougher with every mile, the gentle swell of farmland giving way to broken buttes and stands of dark pine, the temperature dropping with the altitude until her breath fogged in the late afternoon air. She reached the foot of Bear-Tooth Ridge as the sun was going down, gold and enormous over the western buttes, and made a cold camp rather than risk a fire that might draw the wrong attention, and told herself, wrapped in her blanket beneath a sky exploding with more stars than she had ever seen from her own porch, that she had done the sensible thing, the necessary thing, and that if her chest ached at the thought of Harlan's face when he found her note and her absence both, that ache was simply the price of a woman who had learned, hard, that she could only ever fully rely on herself. Harlan Haskins had spent those same 3 days at his brother's bedside in a state that felt, to him, like a man drowning slowly in his own guilt. Mateo would recover. The beating had cracked 2 ribs and split his scalp, but broken nothing that would not mend. But the sight of his younger brother laid low by Vance's foreman, while Harlan himself had ridden away from Ruby in anger rather than understanding, sat in his chest like a stone that would not dissolve. "You are thinking of the widow," Mateo said on the 3rd night, watching his brother pace the small room with an energy that had nothing to do with concern for a healing rib cage. "You have that face our father used to make before he finally rode to Nuevo Laredo to ask our mother's family for her hand, after they had refused him twice already." "It is not the same situation," Harlan said, though without much conviction. "It is exactly the same situation. A stubborn man in love with a stubborn woman, both too proud to say the plain thing plainly." Mateo winced as he shifted against his pillows, but his eyes stayed sharp and knowing. "You left her alone after a fire was set at her door, Harlan. What did you expect her to do while you sat here holding my hand instead of hers? She refused my protection. She told me plainly she would not be caged in another man's house. Did she ask you to abandon your own brother bleeding to stay with her instead? No, she told me to go. Then she understood loyalty better than you gave her credit for, and you have spent 3 days punishing yourself for a choice she made easier for you instead of riding back to tell her you were grateful for it." Mateo closed his eyes, exhausted, but his mouth curved in something almost like a smile. "Go to her, Harlan. I am mending. I have Pascual and a dozen good men watching this camp. Go tell the widow Whitfield that you are not afraid of her strength, only afraid of losing it." Harlan rode for Willow Creek before dawn and found, pinned to Ruby's own door, a note in a hand he was coming to recognize even in its haste, "Gone north to Bear-Tooth Ridge. Silas asked us to look where the old fires burned if he did not return by the fair. I could not wait. Forgive me if this is foolish, but I have been foolish alone for 5 years and find I am tired of it. R.W." The fear that moved through him was sharp and total, but beneath it, unmistakably, ran a thread of something that felt almost like pride, that a woman he loved would ride alone into wild country rather than wait passively for rescue, and he was in the saddle and riding north within minutes, praying to whatever God watched over foolish, brave women and the men who loved them that he would not arrive too late. Ruby found the first fire on the 2nd evening of her search, a thin column of smoke rising from a rocky shelf perhaps a mile up the ridge from where she had made her cold camp, visible only because she had climbed a rise at dusk, specifically to look for exactly such a sign. Her heart leapt. Silas, or someone at least, alive enough to tend a fire, and she began the climb toward it in the fading light, picking her way carefully among loose scree and stunted pine, her father's revolver heavy and reassuring at her hip. She had gone perhaps half the distance when a second fire kindled, smaller and further along the ridge to the west, and then, astonishingly, as she watched, the first fire was smothered and relit twice in quick succession, a deliberate pattern that could not possibly be accidental. Old cavalry signal code. Silas had asked Harlan about the old fire pits, had learned or already known the simple patterns the army had once used to call for help or warn of danger across these high, empty ridges, and he was using them now alive to speak to whoever might be watching from the valley below. The pattern repeated. One long fire, smothered, too short. Then silence, then repeated again from the second position. She had no formal training in any such code, but the rhythm of it felt, unmistakably, like a warning rather than a simple summons asterisk danger. This way, not that way asterisk, and she found herself hesitating on the narrow trail, uncertain whether to press forward toward the first fire or angle west toward the second. It was in that hesitation that she heard the horse behind her on the trail, and spun with the revolver half drawn before she recognized, in the dying light, Harlan Haskins riding hard up the same slope she had climbed, his face a mask of fear that dissolved into something like disbelieving relief the instant he saw her standing whole and unharmed among the rocks. Ruby. He was off his horse and had crossed the distance between them before she had fully lowered the gun, and for one suspended moment neither of them spoke at all, simply stood taking the measure of the other's safety with their eyes, before he pulled her against him in an embrace that had nothing careful or measured in it at all. "You came," she said against his shoulder, and heard her own voice break slightly on the words. "Of course I came. I would have come the moment I found your note, but I did not have wings to fly the distance any faster than a horse could carry me." He drew back enough to look at her face, his hands framing it with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I am sorry, Ruby. I should never have ridden away angry. You did not owe me an accounting of your courage, and I spent 3 days too proud and too frightened to say so. I should not have gone alone," she admitted. "I told myself it was necessity. Some part of it was only stubbornness, and some part of it, I think, was fear that you had already chosen your family over me, and I did not want to sit at home waiting to learn whether that fear was true." "It was never a choice between you and Mateo," Harlan said fiercely. "It was never that, Ruby. You are not a burden set against my family's need. You are becoming, if you will permit it, part of the very thing I would call family, and I have been a fool these 3 days not to say so plainly." There was no time in that moment for either of them to say more, because the signal fire flared again on the ridge above them, the pattern repeating with an urgency that could not be ignored, and both of their attention snapped back to the darkening slope and the mystery still waiting there. "That is Silas's work," Harlan said. "I would know that rhythm anywhere. My father's old sergeant taught it to half the boys in this county before he died. One long, too short, repeated, that is a call for aid. But he lit the second fire further west and let the first die. He is trying to draw whoever watches away from something, toward himself instead." "Away from an ambush," Ruby breathed, understanding arriving cold and sudden. "Colton must have found him first, or nearly. Silas knows someone dangerous waits along the direct path, and he's using the fires to steer us wide of it." They left the horses tethered below the worst of the scree, and climbed the rest of the way on foot, moving as quietly as the loose stone allowed, angling west toward the second fire rather than the first as the pattern seemed to instruct. The last light was failing fast, the temperature dropping sharply with the altitude, and twice Ruby's boots slid on loose shale, and only Harlan's steadying hand kept her from a fall that would have ended the search then and there. They found Silas Cobb crouched behind an outcrop near the second fire, gaunt and filthy, his left leg splinted crudely with a broken tent pole and strips of his own shirt, a pistol shaking slightly in his grip until he recognized the shapes emerging from the darkness and lowered it with a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "Harlan Haskins," he said, his voice cracked from disuse and thirst. "And Ruby Whitfield, as I live and breathe, though I confess I have done precious little breathing easy these past weeks. You found the fires." "We nearly went the wrong way," Ruby said, kneeling beside him, already reaching for her medical bag, assessing the leg with quick, practiced hands even as relief and worry warred in her chest. "What happened, Silas? We've feared the worst for a month. Vance's man Colton caught me on the ridge trail the day after the fair began, going through my saddlebags for the survey copies. I fought him for the horse and lost, took a fall down the scree that broke this leg clean, and I have spent every day since dragging myself between 2 hiding places, living on what little I could forage, waiting and praying someone would think to look here. He gripped Ruby's wrist with sudden, fierce strength. The proof is not lost. I hid the full survey behind the false back of my saddlebag before Colton ever caught me, and buried the bag itself beneath a cairn a quarter-mile east of here. Vance's men do not know it exists. They believe they've frightened away the only witness and left nothing behind to prove their fraud. Colton is still up here somewhere, Harlan said grimly, scanning the darkening ridge. You said he caught you the day after the fair. Has he remained in this country all this time? He and 2 others have camped near the old signal station itself, watching the trails, waiting to see if anyone came looking for me. I lit the fires knowing they might see them too, but I judged the risk worth it, better a chance at rescue than certain death slowly starving on this ridge. Silas's grip on Ruby's wrist tightened further. You must be careful. If they see this second fire, they will come, and they will come armed and unwilling to let any of us leave this mountain to testify. As if summoned by the very words, a shout carried faintly from somewhere along the ridge to the east, followed by the unmistakable sound of men moving quickly through brush and stone, and Harlan's hand went instantly to the pistol at his hip. They've seen the fire, he said. Ruby, can he ride, splinted as he is? Not far and not fast, not tonight, Ruby said, her mind already racing through the limited options a doctor learns to weigh in moments of crisis. But I can bind that leg well enough to bear a slow walk if we support him between us, and there's no choice in it now regardless. They worked fast in the near dark, Ruby splinting the leg properly with materials from her kit while Harlan kept watch, and had Silas upright and moving, leaning heavily between them. By the time 3 shapes crested the rise behind them, lantern lights swinging wild across the rocks, Reed Colton's voice carrying clear and cold across the thin mountain air. I know you're up there, Cobb. Bring the saddlebag down and this can end quiet. Bring company instead and it ends considerably louder. There is no saddlebag with him, Harlan called back, positioning himself between the voice and the 2 people he meant to protect. You've had a month to search this ridge for it and found nothing, because there is nothing left to find. Your man broke a defenseless surveyor's leg and left him to die of exposure, Colton, and there are 2 witnesses standing here now who will swear to that fact before any judge in this territory. Witnesses can be persuaded to change their testimony, Colton's voice answered, closer now, or persuaded to stop testifying altogether. Not these witnesses, Ruby called out, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect it to be. I would remind you, Mr. Colton, that I have spent this entire month treating men's wounds, while you have spent it inflicting them. And I do not believe that arithmetic favors your case before any court in Dakota Territory. A shot rang out then, wild and high, meant to frighten rather than strike. Ruby recognized the same cowardly imprecision as the shots that had spooked Estrella weeks before. And in the chaos of the echo bouncing off the rock walls, Harlan moved with the speed and certainty of a man who had spent a lifetime working dangerous animals in tight spaces. He had his rope from his shoulder and thrown before Ruby fully understood what he intended, the loop settling true around Colton's shoulders as the man came scrambling over the last rise, and one hard pull off his own braced feet sent Colton crashing backward down the loose scree with a cry of surprise and fury. The 2 men behind Colton, seeing their leader tumbling and hearing, distinctly, the unmistakable sound of a second and larger party of riders now audible climbing the trail from below Sheriff Boyd Nash. In fact, whom Harlan had thought to send word to from Mateo's camp before ever setting out, arriving now with 2 deputies drawn by the very shot Colton himself had fired, lost their nerve entirely, and fled into the darkness rather than press the fight further. Colton, winded and furious, tangled in Harlan's rope at the bottom of the scree slope, found himself looking up moments later into the lantern light of Sheriff Nash's approach, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man whose employer's money had suddenly become considerably less useful to him, that his evening had taken a turn from which no amount of Vance's silver would extract him. "Well," Sheriff Nash said, surveying the scene with the weary patience of a lawman who had clearly ridden hard and far to arrive at it. "Reed Colton, trussed up like a Christmas goose on a mountainside, a missing surveyor found alive after a month, and Ruby Whitfield and Harlan Haskins standing over the both of them looking like they've just wrestled the devil himself. I imagine there's a story here that'll take some telling." "There is," Harlan said, and though exhaustion had settled heavy into every line of his body, Ruby saw in the lantern light that he was smiling. "But it will keep until we've gotten Sela's Cobb down off this mountain and into a bed where he belongs." The journey down took the better part of the night, slow and careful, with Sela supported between two horses on a makeshift litter Harlan fashioned from saddle blankets and pine poles, Sheriff Nash's deputies riding ahead to secure a wagon from the nearest homestead. And by the time the sun rose gold and enormous over the eastern buttes, they had Sela's Cobb resting in a real bed in Bristlecone, with the town's one physician tending his leg. And Reed Colton locked in the county jail awaiting the sheriff's questions about who, precisely, had paid him $500 and for what purpose. Cornelius Vance did not go quietly. He came to the jail himself within the day, demanding Colton's release, insisting the man had been acting entirely on his own account in some private grievance against a surveyor, and it might have gone poorly for the truth of the matter had Sela's Cobb not, once rested and fed and no longer feverish, been entirely willing and able to testify in detail about exactly whose voice he had heard giving Colton his orders on the night before the fair. Carried to him clearly across a still evening by a trick of the canyon acoustics that Vance, in his arrogance, had never troubled to consider. The buried saddlebag, retrieved by Harlan's own vaqueros 2 days later, exactly where Sela's had described it, proved everything the whispers had suggested and more. Forged plat corrections, a paper trail of bribes to a land office clerk in the territorial capital, and clear evidence that Cornelius Vance had spent 3 years systematically altering survey lines to claim water rights and creek frontage that rightfully belonged to a dozen smaller homesteaders across the county, Ruby Whitfield's own claim chief among them. The land office hearing, when it finally convened 3 weeks later than originally scheduled, on account of the territorial marshal needing time to properly serve Vance with charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm, was consequently a rather different affair than Ruby had first imagined riding toward it. She had expected to stand alone before the registrar defending the validity of her own hard-won claim against some vague accusation of irregularity. Instead, she stood as one witness among several, her testimony bolstered by Sela's Cobb's recovered survey, by Harlan Haskins' account of the shots that had spooked his mare and the fire set at Ruby's own barn, and by the sworn statement of Reed Colton himself, who had discovered, in the cold light of a jail cell, that turning evidence against a wealthy man who had already abandoned him to face charges alone was a considerably better use of his remaining freedom than loyalty to a former employer's $500. Cornelius Vance's claims across the disputed sections were voided entirely. His name would, within the year, be struck from the county's Cattlemen's Association rolls, and he would sell what remained of his legitimate holdings and leave Dakota Territory altogether, rather than face trial in a county that had turned decisively against him. Ruby Whitfield received her patent to the Willow Creek claim on a bright, cold morning in late October, the paper bearing her name alone, the land that she and Thomas had broken together now hers beyond any question or challenge, secured not by a man's protection but by her own testimony, her own courage, and the truth she had helped uncover and refused to be frightened away from. It was that same evening, with the patent still smelling faintly of the registrar's ink and folded carefully in her coat pocket, that Harlan Haskins rode to Willow Creek to find her sitting on her own porch step in the last light, watching the harvest moon rise fat and orange over the stubbled fields. I heard the hearing went as it should, he said, settling beside her without being asked, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. It did. I am, as of this morning, entirely and legally the owner of every acre Thomas and I claimed 5 years ago. She turned the words over in her mouth, testing them, and found them wonderful. I do not think I have felt so entirely myself in a very long time. I am glad of it, Harlan said, and meant it, though something careful lingered beneath the words, something Ruby had learned by now to recognize as him weighing a thing before he said it. I have been thinking, these past weeks, about what comes now. Mateo is fully healed and has taken to running the West Camp himself, quite well, in fact, better perhaps than I ever did at his age. My mother's cousin manages my house with an efficiency that leaves me largely unnecessary there most days. And I find myself, Ruby Whitfield, wondering how a man goes about asking a woman who has just fought so hard to keep her own land whether she might consider sharing a life with a man who has land of his own, without that asking sounding like another demand that she surrender something she has only just secured. Ruby's heart had begun to beat very fast, but she made herself wait, sensing he had not finished. I do not want you to give up this claim, he continued, more firmly now, as though he had rehearsed the words on the ride over and meant to get them right. I do not want you to sell Willow Creek, or abandon it, or fold it quietly into my ranch as though what you built here with Thomas mattered less than what I built alone. You fought too hard for this patent for me to ask you to set it aside for my convenience, and I would rather live the rest of my life exactly as I am now than be the man who asks a woman to trade her hard-won dream for the comfort of mine. Then, what are you asking, Harlan? Ruby said softly, though she thought, with a rising warmth in her chest, that she already understood. I am asking whether a rancher's spread and a homesteader's claim might sit well enough beside each other, that a man could ride 2 miles each morning to help a woman with her harvest, and ride 2 miles back each evening to sleep in his own house, until such a day as she might tell him plainly that 2 miles has become an inconvenience she would rather not suffer any longer, and that his house and hers might as well become one house, on land that remains, on every paper that matters, entirely her own. He turned to face her fully then, and the careful rehearsal fell away entirely, leaving only the plain, unguarded truth of him. I am asking you to marry me, Ruby, not to rescue you and not to be rescued by you, though I confess you have already done a fair share of both for me and for people I love. I am asking because I have not felt so entirely myself either. Since the day I watched you breathe life back into a foal, everyone else had already given up for lost, and I have known since that hour that I did not intend to let a woman like you pass through my life and out of it again. Ruby did not answer immediately, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted, for one long moment, simply to hold the shape of the question in her chest and feel how thoroughly it fit there. I love Thomas, she said finally quietly. I will always have loved him, and this land will always carry his hands in it as much as mine, however many years pass. I do not think you are asking me to set that aside, and I would not agree to it if you were. I would never ask that, Harlan said. I would only ask to be permitted to add my own hands to it, alongside his memory rather than instead of it. Then yes, Ruby said, and felt the word leave her lighter than she had expected, carried on a relief and a joy that had been building, she realized now for weeks. Yes, Harlan Haskins, I will marry you. On my own land, under my own name on the patent, with your ranch 2 miles distant for exactly as long as 2 miles feels sensible to either of us, and not 1 day longer. He laughed then, a full, unguarded sound she had not heard from him before, and kissed her there on the porch step with the harvest moon rising huge and gold above them, and Ruby Whitfield, widow, veterinarian, homesteader, felt the last cold edge of the fear that had followed her since February finally, fully melt away. They were married in November, in the small church at Bristlecone, with Silas Cobb standing as Harlan's witness, still favoring his healing leg with a cane he swore he would discard the moment the ground froze hard enough to give him proper footing, and with Mateo Haskins, fully recovered and grinning like a man who had known the outcome long before either of the two people it most concerned, standing beside him. Amundsen, the foal everyone had said was doomed, stood grown into a leggy, curious yearling in the churchyard fence line, having been led there by one of Harlan's vaqueros at Ruby's own insistence, because she had said, only half in jest, that the foal had as much claim to witnessing the day as anyone. They built, in the years that Ruby had already begun quietly planning even as she stood in her wedding dress that November afternoon, a life that honored the promise both of them had made, unknowing, to a man who had trusted them each to look after the other. Silas Cobb recovered fully and took up a permanent position with the Territorial Land Office, ensuring that no other widow's claim would fall prey so easily to a wealthy man's greed. Vance's name faded from the county's memory within a few short years, replaced by talk of the railroad spur that came through exactly where the surveys, honestly drawn, had always said it should. And on the land along Willow Creek, where a widow had once knelt alone in the mud of a February thaw to bury a husband she loved, a rancher's hands and a veterinarian's hands worked the same soil together, two claims joined not by surrender but by choice, two people who had found in each other, not rescue but partnership, and had built from that partnership a home neither of them would ever again have to face the frontier without.